has to be Anderson Silva, potty mouth Anderson Silva, who was on the MMA Hour with Ariel Helwani earlier this week. Great show. Anderson was speaking in English and dropping words that I don't think Anderson's mom would have approved of. Basically saying that it's bull crap that Georges St Pierre is skipping the line at middleweight and fighting Michael Bisping. It's held up the entire division. And really, that's a big part of this issue, but I think Anderson's frustration specifically comes in that he wants to fight in Rio. He wants to fight at UFC 212 June 3rd in Rio de Janeiro. He has wanted that ever since, the UFC essentially put that date on the calendar. He had it. He was supposed to fight Kelvin Gastelum, but then Gastelum was pulled from the card for failing a drug test for marijuana. So now Anderson Silva doesn't have an opponent. And the UFC has made him several offers, but now he's being a little selective, and he feels like he has the right to be selective. He says, I have done so much for this company. I have put it on the map in so many different ways. I've stepped up on short notice. I fought Daniel Cormier at UFC 200 on essentially, 48 hours notice. So stop pulling me around in different directions and give me a fight that I want in front of my hometown fans in Brazil. And the fight he wants is Yoel Romero for an interim title. He doesn't just want Romero. He wants an interim title attached to it. So, Sandhu, I will turn the mic over to you. What do you make of this? Who's right? Who's wrong? Is Anderson Silva, is his request, is it valid, or is he out of line here?
Look, if Anderson Silva and Yoel Romero both want to fight each other, I have absolutely no problem with that, especially with the middleweight title picture being held up for the foreseeable future. It keeps Romero active. If Romero's happy to travel to Rio and fight Anderson Silva, that'll make Anderson Silva happy to fight in Rio. But to put in an interim title, I'm just not on board with it. I don't like the idea of interim titles in the first place. There's no need for an interim title right now because the official championship will be defended later on this year, so it's not technically on hiatus. But it does kind of make you think, this Bisping GSP fight that the UFC have made, the collateral damage just continues to kind of rear its ugly face. You've got Gegard Mousasi currently out of contract, and I'm sure he's negotiating hard with the UFC, or at least his management will be, to try and get, a title fight, as part of that kind of new contract. You've got Anderson Silva and Yoel Romero both wanting to fight for an interim title. And, it's a very unfortunate situation because this Bisping GSP, fight has really kind of made some of the guys at the upper end of that middleweight, division really unhappy. And, I can understand it from their point of view, but at the same time, I can also understand, from Bisping's point of view, if you're Bisping and you get offered GSP, that's the biggest payday you're ever going to get in your entire life, so you're not going to turn that down. And but bringing it all back to Anderson Silva, he did kind of, really show some big frustrations, and he wasn't shy with his language, and especially doing it all in English, which he hasn't been known to do in the past. So I can definitely sympathize, especially with some of the things that he said with regards to a promise being made that when Georges St Pierre did come back, that the Silva GSP super fight is what the UFC were going to do. But that was all promised by the old ownership when, the Fertitta brothers were in charge. That's all changed. WME, IMG, they're not thinking in that same kind of direction. And, Anderson Silva isn't the only one. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, it's not that I'm against Anderson coming out and speaking his mind. In fact, I'm all for it. And I think in a lot of ways it's needed, it's necessary, it's well received. A lot of times, and I don't want to specify and point out and I guess point out an issue with a specific region of fighters. But Brazilian fighters, they seem to have a problem with this, and that is that they fight terrific. I mean, a lot of talent out of that region. But you saw it with Jose Aldo, too. Don't always know how to manipulate the media and create the headlines necessary to get the fights that they want. And some of that's probably just a cultural thing, and some of it's probably an English thing. And I think some of it is a little bit just of a motivational thing. Again, I have no problem with Anderson coming out and saying what he's saying, but I don't know how effective this is going to be. Let's just put it that way. I just don't think there's certain ways and realities that you just have to. There's certain realities that you have to acknowledge, and that is that I'm not. The UFC is most likely not going to create an interim title. The champion is active. They've decided to make this fight with Georges St Pierre. That is the way that they're going. They're not going to create an interim title for no reason. Dana White has already said that numerous times. So then what can I do? What can I do? And it's to a certain extent getting on a platform like the MMA Hour, speaking to Brazilian media, speaking to English-speaking media, and complaining about it is one way to go about it. And it's not even necessarily a bad way to go about it. But then there's also just the reality of, well, I have to step up and I have to win a fight. And you're getting that opportunity against Yoel Romero. I don't mind him asking for the interim title, but to say that he's going to retire and that he doesn't want the fight unless there's an interim title attached, I still think a lot of the same rewards would come to Anderson Silva if the fight is not for an interim title. I mean, he was going to fight Kelvin Gastelum when there was no title fight attached to it. Now he's getting a chance to fight the number one ranked guy. I mean, I guess I don't see where his issue is with this. I could see where Yoel's issue would be with it. Why am I going to fly all the way down to Brazil, take a fight that's basically on short notice at this point, risk my spot in line against a guy like Anderson Silva who can still be very dangerous. I only want to do it for an interim title. If it was Romero being really outspoken, then I could get behind it. But with Anderson really making these demands, I just don't think the fans will get behind it. And history says when the fans do not get behind what you're selling, then you don't have any sell. You got nothing. And by and large, the biggest reaction I saw to Anderson's demands is that this guy was lucky to win his last fight against Derek Brunson, and prior to that, he was on a losing streak. So I think there's a way in which to use the media to your advantage, and these Brazilian guys sometimes they clearly haven't mastered it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Anderson Silva's got all the upside in the world if he gets that Romero fight in Brazil. And like you said, even if it's not for an interim title, if you beat Romero, you're essentially catapulted right into the number one contendership right there and then, because you just beat the number one guy. And yeah, why would you take this fight if you're Romero? What's the upside for you? And yeah, again, like you said, the online reaction yesterday from what I was seeing was Anderson Silva was lucky to win his last fight. He's on a massive losing streak. It'd be a different story if he was perhaps, coming off a three or four fight win streak, but he's not. And I thought the Kelvin Gastelum fight was a decent one for him to get, especially being in Brazil. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what's gonna come of this right now, because he has had this big outburst. I don't know if Dana White's gonna go and talk to him. Some of what he said, did hold some kind of water with me. I mean, he has helped the UFC out when they've been in a pinch. Most notably and most recently last summer at UFC 200. I mean, can you imagine if Silva didn't step up to fight Daniel Cormier in that co-main event, just to have some name value on such a historic event? So I can understand and sympathize with some of his frustrations. But I mean, the whole time when he was talking, I was kind of thinking back to myself, isn't Anderson Silva the guy that signed, was it an 8, 10, 12 fight contract with the UFC? And that always frustrates me when these fighters are signing these long-term contracts, when the industry and the business and the sport is just changing so quickly and so fast on a yearly basis, that things like, like you mentioned, the Reebok sponsorship situation meant that he had to cut his ties with Nike. That cost him financially. But you're the guy that signed this long-term contract with all these fights. So who's to blame here, really, right?
Yeah, and it's as we sit here, I can't remember exactly when was GSP Michael Bisping announced. It was announced right before 209, right? So we're looking at 2 months since then. And I remember saying when George was going to come back and they hadn't announced which fight he was going to be in, that my top choice would have been the welterweight title fight, just because I thought it would be a really awesome move to be able to vacate a belt, walk away for basically 3.5 years, come back and win it again. I just thought that would be an amazing, amazing thing for George to do. He didn't want to do that. He wanted the Michael Bisping fight, which I completely understand. But now sitting here today, it's just like, why didn't they just make the George Anderson fight? Why wasn't George more on board with that? That's the fight that should have happened, really, because you would have avoided all of this mess and holding up the divisions, and you still would have had a huge fight. And I got to believe that George would be okay with that fight on a certain level. I mean, it's not in the past when they were talking about a super fight and he was the champion and Anderson was the champion, there was always like, well, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense as much as we want to see it. And these guys are the two top pound for pound fighters in the world. George is so much smaller than Anderson, but now, Anderson is far past his prime. George probably is as well, but maybe not as much so. The size is not a holdup anymore in this fight. So I don't know. It kind of just makes you wish that the UFC would have saw this coming, talked to George a little bit more and said, let's do the Anderson fight first. That's the one that makes sense, and that's the one that doesn't hold the entire sport hostage, especially because now it looks like George can't fight until the fall or winter, so you're just prolonging everything. It's kind of a mess. But to close up this one, I will just say that I don't think Anderson Silva is serious about retiring. If he doesn't get the interim title fight against Romero, I do believe he will fight again. Whether or not he fights in Brazil, I know that his team is still working on that for him, and he's still down there training as if he's going to fight. So we'll see what happens. A guy really wants to fight in his home country of Brazil, so hopefully they find a way to make that happen.